The 8th pick will be made by the San Antonio Spurs.
Well, that sucked. Look, we're not going to talk about this. Yes, it sucks they lost the first rounder. Yes, even in a weak draft. But the Toronto Raptors still do have 2 picks in the 2024 draft that we can talk about. While this class has been considered weak throughout the year, it's weak in the same way that, say, the 2013 draft class was weak. If you're looking for a franchise player at the top of the draft, you probably won't find it, or at least the best player in the draft won't be the obvious selection. If they were, they would have gone first. If you're looking for depth, someone to fill out the roster around your core pieces, then there's a lot of interesting players that could be donning whatever rebrand the Raptors are looking to unveil next season. And while it isn't fair to assume or have the expectations that the Raptors will land some all-NBA caliber talent with the 19th pick they received from the Pacers in the Pascal Siakam trade, it is worth noting that even the 2000 draft, widely considered the worst draft class in NBA history, managed to eke out 3 All-Star players. Granted, they were all one-time All-Stars, and one of them is considered one of the worst All-Stars of all time, but to be fair, that class did also pump out its share of decent role players like Mike Miller and Hedo Turkoglu, and before anybody says anything, yes, he was bad for the Raptors, no, Hedo was not drafted by the Raptors, so I'm still going to count it. Right now, the Raptors have big holes in their bench, not to mention their starting unit has some serious questions to answer. Sure, we know that Scotty Barnes, RJ Barrett, Emmanuel Quickley, and Jakob Poeltl are going to start, but who's playing 2 through 4? There's big holes in the forward and center rotations, pun not intended, and the backup point guard is also a noteworthy hole that needs to be potentially filled in this draft. Given just how dire the Raptors bench has been for the past few seasons, coming out of this draft just getting their own Mike Miller, that effective role player who might not necessarily be a star but does what you need your supporting cast to do, filling out the roster with those types of players is an important part of retooling this team's roster. Arguably, it's just as important as getting the depth pieces to support your franchise star as it is to draft said star, and the Raptors have already gotten the hard part out of the way, finding their next face of the franchise in Scotty Barnes. With that in mind, let's go over some of the most likely candidates for them to draft at 19, the pool of players who are expected to be in that 15 to 25 range, as well as some names who will probably pop up in the early 30s because, as mentioned earlier, the Raptors have 2 picks in this draft, not just 1. These breakdowns for the individual players aren't going to be super in-depth. We've got a lot of names to go through, and I am by no means a scouting expert, and even then, experts get it wrong all the time. Scouting is really hard. So if any of these players sound interesting to you, give them a look. Check out some of their film, read a scouting report, take a gander at some of their highlights on YouTube. We're not going in any particular order, we're not going to go by position, just consider this a formal introduction to one of the players that could come out of the 2024 NBA draft as a Toronto Raptor. We'll go through the first rounders first in 2 sections, the most likely available candidates, and then the ones who would be considered a stretch for one reason or another. They're either a reach down in the draft for Toronto's current position, or candidates to drop from significantly higher than they were expected to go, Cam Whitmore going to the Rockets at 20 in the 2023 draft. Let's get started with the most likely names, shall we?
Perfect answer to Kobe Johnson's defense.
Collier, step back, hits.
Believe it or not, Isaiah Collier was seen as a consensus top 5 pick in this draft before a truly topsy-turvy season took place. A 6'5" guard built like an M4 Sherman, Collier is equal parts swift as he is strong. Whether it's using his size for paint penetration or to create opportunities for his teammates, he's making his presence felt on that end of the floor. On the other side, look, he's got a lot of work to be done on defense. He does have the size to be an impactful defender, at least in so much as he should be able to guard other guards. He's never going to be a 1-to-4 sort of guy, but his engagement on that end was lacking. More so in the first half of the season than the second, but that latter half does come with the question of where was this effort before, and are you going to keep this up? It's not like he was locking up guys at the point of attack anyway. He can also be more indecisive than you like when the ball is in his hands, while averaging more assists than he does turnovers, so he is still a positive in that regard, but does have some work to do on his general decision making. If there's any major criticisms to be had about his offensive game, it's that his shot simply doesn't pass the eye test. He doesn't have a 3-ball, and his 3-throw shooting, and this is for a guard mind you, is under 70%, which is downright damning. His inability to make his shots at the line really does undermine how great he is at attacking the rim. He averaged nearly 6 free throws a game. It's hard to say how much of his shooting woes can be blamed on a hand injury that led to that aforementioned lopsided season, and it is at least worth noting that he did shoot slightly better from both inside and out of the arc in high school. Isaiah is far from the most polarizing prospect in this draft, We'll get to Zach Edey later, but he certainly has one of the longer lists in regards to questions around his ability to either be a lead or backup guard at the 1 or the 2. Probably the 1 because, well, shooting woes.
Watch the open floor look. McCain is a machine. So another tray.
In contrast, here's one of the best shooters in the entire class. McCain's mechanics matches his many makes. 41% on nearly 6 attempts a night, nearly 90% from the line. Everything suggests that Jared is going to be an absolute sniper from outside, and he's certainly capable of taking it to the rim when asked to. The real question mark for him is whether he'll be able to make use of that lofty scoring gravity he'll bring, because for as much as one can attribute his low assist numbers to his role in Duke's offense, he didn't showcase much to suggest his playmaking upside is all that high. For a guard, he's got good rebounding chops, he's great as a help defender who's always playing with high energy. It's really that playmaking where there's a major question mark. McCain has very few red flags. He's a high floor, admittedly low ceiling selection who can contribute right away. The player that he is, they're really good at what they do, but beyond the questions about whether he can be that backup playmaker for when Quickly sits, or even if a backcourt with the two of them can hold up defensively due to just how small it would be, they're both basically 6'3" or under, their game doesn't exactly scream high ceiling, like there's another level to reach. In a draft where even the lottery picks have their share of question marks, McCain is an appealingly safe pick that you can very easily see in the Raptors rotation, regardless of where in said rotation they'll end up.
Off his feet, picked it back up, Walter hanging in air, and he scores it!
One of the best shot creators in college basketball last season. Jacoby Walter can put the ball on the floor, into the basket, and then get set on the other end of the floor to guard along the perimeter. His three-point production and general efficiency did dip as the season went on, but this is one of those cases where the eye test will tell you what the stats don't, i.e. the mechanics are not the reason why those shots didn't go in. He reminds me a lot of fellow Bear Keontae George from last year's draft, albeit Walter is nowhere near as explosive as Keontae was, and defensively, Jacoby plays with a lot more tenacity than George did, not to mention he boasts a much lengthier wingspan of 6'10". That said, he's in this range for a reason, and besides the efficiency, the question is whether or not he's going to be able to make the most of his shot creation capabilities via his playmaking, because his general decision making, it does leave a little bit to be desired. He hasn't shown much in the way of court vision, and in being able to dish out assists with ease. If Jared McCain is the prospect that you're comfortable slotting into a starting lineup or bench rotation, then Jacoby Walter is the one that you're excited to see whether or not they can brush up on their ever-important efficiency or deliver on their intriguing promise as a two-way wing with the ability to create shots for themselves or their teammates.
Connect, trying to get to the basket again. He blocks him!
The most dominant player in college basketball for the past few years, Zach Edey is built like no one else, quite literally. He is an enormous 7-foot center. The man averaged a 20-point double-double for the entire season this year and was an automatic bucket from inside the arc who flashed some upside as a playmaker capable of catering his scoring gravity to elevate his teammates when doubled. He still turned the ball over more than he dished out dimes, but I digress. Edey is probably the most divisive prospect in this draft because a lot of what made him so effective in college basketball is what's causing people to question his game and whether or not it's going to be able to transition into the NBA, where centers like Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid, Bam Adebayo, even guys who are not necessarily centers, big men like Giannis Antetokounmpo who are just as big, as strong if not stronger, and more skilled. Beyond his size, one of the main factors in his effectiveness was because Purdue built the team around him. It's a hard sell to warp one's entire defense or offense to cater to or cover Edey's strengths and weaknesses when he has yet to play a day in the league. His interior gravity is immense, but he's never been a floor-spacing big man. Then again, neither was Brook Lopez, and look at how he turned out. If nothing else, Edey's lack of lateral mobility, his inability to defend the pick and roll right now, that is a problem. He's fine as a drop defender, and his foot speed being dreadful is a slight exaggeration because it's not that he's slow, it's just that it takes a bit of time for him to get going. Once he's on the move, he's surprisingly mobile for his size, but those first few steps can mean the difference between him being able to switch onto the perimeter from the paint or not being able to do that. While I'm personally not a big fan of Zach, I can at least see why people want to draft him, at least amongst the crowd that wants him for the player that he is, and isn't cheerleading solely based on the fact that he's Canadian for him to become a Raptor. Like, we've already got a few Canucks on the roster right now to cheer for. Is RJ not enough? Do you have anything against Chris Boucher? Regardless of where you stand on Zach Edey as a prospect, whether you're for or against him, I think everyone can agree with at least this. Speaking strictly on NBA comparisons, there really isn't anyone in the league quite like Edey, and there probably won't be for some time.
Kolek is wide open and knocks down a three.
In a draft like this, going with the safest option is a fairly reasonable play, smart even. And there aren't going to be many picks more safe than Tyler Kolek in this range, and given that he is going to be older than Scotty Barnes is in his rookie season, well, he better be. The 23-year-old is the definition of complete. He can score at all three levels and efficiently at that. His decision-making with the ball is terrific. The man has an assist-to-turnover ratio of 3-1, and his feel for the game is inspired. How his defense will translate is up in the air due to him being 6'3" at most, and he doesn't have that run-you-out-of-the-gym athleticism to make up for his lack of size, but as far as floor generals go, you won't find many safer options this late in the draft, or in the draft in general, than Kolek.
Waving hands. What about Andy Katz, who's right in front of him? Look out, Philip! Posting!
Hey kids, do you like Kelly? Do you want a player who can become Prime Kelly under his very tutelage? Yeah, that's basically the appeal of Kyle Filipowski, a stretch four who can play the 5 but is ultimately not a great rim protector. You probably want somebody else playing at center. Decent passer, decent footwork in the post. I really don't have a lot to say about him. If you've seen Kelly Olynyk play, then you've seen what Kyle is expected to play like. Prime Olynyk is a nice rotation player to have. A bit redundant given we had the actual Kelly, but I digress. Look, we've got a lot of guys to go through. Not all of them are going to be super interesting. Now, if you want to talk interesting prospects,
Thomas up ahead. And that one blocked by Missi.
As far as rim protecting big men go in this draft, Yves Missi is probably the team's best bet in this range. Super athletic, a terrific finisher with a soft touch around the rim, 6'11" with an enormous 7'2" wingspan. He has some potential to become a stretch 5 given his 3-throw shooting got better as the season went on, but he's likely going to be relegated to finishing plays, at least to start out, rim running big man rather than creating for himself on offense. On defense though, he's everything you could ask for in a center. Fierce and competitive and always looking to contest shots. I've seen some people compare him to Pascal Siakam as a prospect, mostly due to their background, i.e. a Cameroonian who played soccer earlier in their life and picked up basketball later on. As for the way they play, you can see some resemblance to prospect Pascal. Missi's handle is similarly loose to what Siakam's was when he entered the league, and he showed some flashy footwork in the paint along with a touch of self-creation, and Pascal did end up playing center for a couple of seasons, even if that was because we didn't have an actual center. I will say that it's hard to see Missi becoming the playmaker that Pascal is, and beyond positional expectations, I'd say that Missi has a lot more questions on offense, namely surrounding the expectations of him to shoot threes at the next level versus the reality of him not doing so at Baylor. Granted, he wasn't asked to do so as a part of their offense, and in fact his role in their offense was pretty limited. They firmly placed him in that rim-running big man role. Missi's the sort of player that'll probably be in the rotation because of his defensive prowess rather than his offense, and just being on the floor whatsoever will be huge for him developing the rest of his game. Now, the one knock against him for the Raptors drafting him specifically, shooting concerns aside, he's not an advanced stat starling like a lot of Raptors' recent picks, which would make him a very un-Toronto selection. Still, he's probably got the second or third highest ceiling among centers in this draft, and unlike the number 1 candidate, he has a much more realistic path to being the ideal version of himself.
Good play, and Baco's 3 won't go, but there's Ware, and Ware, count it!
Speaking of that player, Kel'el Ware is frustrating to talk about, because he is himself a very frustrating player. His combination of athleticism, size, and potential to be a stretch 5, keyword being potential, not to mention potential on defense given said size and athleticism, should make him a no-brainer top 10 selection. The issue, and it's been discussed to death at this point, is the intangibles. Specifically, Ware's motor and lack of maturity makes him a huge risk, pun not intended, despite all the intrigue he brings as a stretch center. Now, this could be a case where a front office does their due diligence and they like what they see or hear in a workout or interview, thinking they can hone in on that raw talent in the same way that the Grizzlies overlooked reported character issues with G.G. Jackson in the 2023 draft and got an absolute steal, but beyond the motor concerns, his footwork and focus on defense can be dubious at best, and a lot of his upside on that end is based more on potential than what he'll immediately bring to a team, and I'm not just talking about the whole he needs to get the NBA body. There's a reason why I haven't brought it up with any of these prospects, because every single one of these prospects needs to get the NBA body. It's not unique to him. This is one of those draft picks where if I was at the helm, well, clearly something's gone wrong, but if that were the case, I wouldn't make it outside looking in and all, but I'd be ecstatic if this front office thought that they could unlock Kel'el because he's one of the few high-ceiling players in this draft, the kind where you can see them become a star even if a lot of swing factors have to go his way, and with Ware, that list of swing factors is pretty extensive. So those are the most likely names to be potentially picked in the first round and roughly the range that the Raptors will be in. One thing to keep in mind is just because a player is expected to be in an aforementioned range, it doesn't necessarily mean they'll be on the board. In this draft, there is a serious chance we'll see more than one prospect drop and another one reached for. If ever there was a draft to test the mantra of taking the best player available, it would be this one because who the best player is in a given range is highly debatable. So let's make like a gymnast and get some stretches in.
Carrington tried to shoot it. Tough one. Got it!
That felt good. Alright, so back to the players. Carlton Bub Carrington, a 6'5" combo guard who does a little bit of everything. He's a great rebounder. He can dish out dimes with ease. He's got some serious shooting chops, outside of the paint anyway. That mid-range game is gorgeous. He's not the most elite of athletes, that paint penetration and general finishing does need some work, and his defensive potential has more to do with his tools, his size, than it does with what he has shown on that end of the floor. He wasn't exactly racking up steals at the point of attack. But he is one of the few guards with upside that could be on the board, and simultaneously, one of the few guards that one doesn't have to wonder whether or not his size needs to quickly would be the main point of contention in a Bob Emmanuel backcourt. A bib, if you will, being put on the Raptors floor. His name has come up as a potential riser of late due to his craftiness and the level of self-creation he's displayed for someone so young. He's only going to be 19 and he's one of the youngest players in the draft overall, but how far up he'll go if he does turn out to be a draft day riser is up in the air.
15 seconds remaining. Being defended by Ward. Dillingham jumper. Got it! Kentucky takes the lead.
Oh, right, these two guards. Okay, so there's been some buzz about Rob Dillingham potentially being a draft day dropper, similar to fellow Kentucky guard Ty Washington back in 2022. Granted, the two are very different players. Riper is a hyper-athletic, score-first guard with bottom 5 defense among the draftees, but I digress. The other point guard player, oh right, Rob is also not a great playmaker. The other point guard player with the potential to drop out of the lottery, Nikola Topic, is another divisive name to throw out there, though for different reasons than Zach or Isaiah. It's undoubtable that his playmaking is sublime. He's arguably the most skilled playmaker in the class. His finishing at the rim is downright elite, and bear in mind he's doing so against fully grown men while being a teenager, and while his defense isn't good, I don't know where he's going with this. He's just not a good defender, though, unlike Rob, his size is less of a reason for him being a liability on that end of the floor, given he's 6'6", with a roughly equivalent wingspan. As far as high upside swings go, Nikola is perhaps the most interesting offensive option that could be available at this stage in the draft, with the sheer level of artistry he possesses when the ball's in his hand, but the injuries, as in plural. There's been a lot of hoopla about how severe his recent ACL tear is, along with his agent and team allegedly downplaying the severity of it. Whether or not one believes that, the fact of the matter is that this wasn't even his first major lower body injury that he's had this season. He had an injury that took him off the court for months prior to this. Being an injury risk this early into his season, yeah, that's sure to scare people into thinking that they might be drafting the latest member of the Ball brothers. Highly talented guards who can make an enormous impact on the floor when they're on it, who unfortunately just cannot stay on the floor, and unlike Lonzo, there's not a shitty shoe or the Bulls' negligent medical staff in sight to blame it on. Also, like I said, Topic is nowhere near as tantalizing a prospect on the defensive end as either Ball brother was, but I digress. I don't know how much stock I'd put into either guard being on the board by 19, but Topic's injury history is definitely more worrying than Rob being the black hole that he is on the defensive end. Like, I expect Dillingham to at least play in his rookie season, whereas with Nikola, I can't be sure if he'll suit up so everyone can overreact to him in Summer League, let alone during the NBA season proper. Then again, Ochai Anunoby was projected to go way higher than he ultimately did in the 2017 draft, largely due to his own season-ending injury, so for Topic specifically, it's at least worth acknowledging him as the more likely of the two to fall, even if the fit with either of them is questionable defensively if one assumes they'll start for the team or share the floor at some point with Emmanuel Quickley. With Topic specifically, there's also the worry about taking the ball out of Quickley's hands and affecting his own development of his own playmaking. So those are the guys from the first round. Now, the Raptors do have another pick in this draft, and it's from the Pistons, and that means it just so happens to be the best one you could possibly get in this draft for the second day. Yeah, the draft takes place over 2 days, which might lead to a higher chance of this pick being moved, but we'll talk about this scenario in a moment. For now, let's assume that the Raptors do stay at 31 and go over some of the names of intriguing players that might be the first called out on that very day. Which it's starting at 4 for some reason. Why did you even bother?
Extended his 6'11" frame, and here's Smith on the other end. Wow!
The G League Ignite season was absolutely miserable. To mismanagement that failed to live up to its goal of providing players an alternative avenue of entering the league, the lack of solid foundation to help their players develop, up to and including the team's construction, the Ignite's issues extended over to evaluating guys like lottery-bound Ron Holland, Matt Buzelis, and, relevant to the Raptors, Tyler Smith. If we're talking about players who fit the profile that this front office adores, Tyler Smith is near the top of the list. He's versatile, at least in theory, he has good size, and while his three-point shooting does need to be taken with a grain of salt, the actual mechanics look solid. The big questions for Smith are on the defensive end. A lot of his potential there is, for now, just that. At 6'11" with a 7'1" wingspan, he has the size to be immensely impactful on that end of the floor, but that 2.5 stock stats is a bit deceitful. There's a lot of times where he just doesn't seem engaged and he's really bad at screen navigation. It's also an open question as to where he's going to fit in at the NBA level. Is he a center? Is he a wing? Is he going to be stuck at the 4 next to a big man? Wherever you place him, there's a lot to like about Smith in theory. The offensive upside is tremendous. He can do a little bit of just about everything from rolling inside to catching and shooting from out, and he's got a nice pull-up game too. It's really whether he can display that same motor on the defensive end as he can in getting a bucket. Basically, is he going to be more than Christian Wood? He's not an amazing playmaker, but he's a good decision maker with the ball in his hands, and did I mention he's 19? Think about how many 19-year-old big men come into this league with anything approaching a bag, or at least the ability to shoot threes as well as Smith can. For the 31st pick, he'd be a risky swing, but one worthy of consideration.
Looking for consistency, Joseph, blocked by Dunn.
You might be wondering how a player that's considered the best defender in this class would wind up in the second round. That's because Ryan Dunn's offensive game is terrible. It's terrible. There's not much of a way to put it. There really isn't a great comparison for him as a prospect because even guys like Matisse Thybulle, who were very much defense-first prospects, were better from the free throw line than he was. I don't want to pretend like he can't be impactful on that end of the floor. The 6'8" forward has the tools to be an effective driver, but right now, his offensive game stands in stark contrast to his polished, all-defensive caliber ability to disrupt the opposing team's own offense. The Raptors' defense was pitiful last season, and the team absolutely needs more sides on the wings, especially so to allow Scotty Barnes to excel as a help defender, but while the team's offense was a lot better and certainly more fun to watch, it didn't exactly become elite unless you have the conundrum that they and many other teams without a contender-esque offense do with drafting Dunn. He's a revelation on one side of the ball, but, at least for now, a non-factor on the other. He's not even particularly good as a passer or a decision maker, so yeah, not bringing much of a new dynamic to that side. His defensive prowess will be welcome all the same, but whether he'll be similarly productive on the offensive side, well, I'll put it like this. Dunn's shot has a lot of reworking to be done. Pun very much intended. If you want to talk potential second round steals out in the open, then Pacon Dadit's name should be at the top of one's list. He's had a limited role in his team thus far, but what he's been able to show in the small amount of minutes he's been given in that role is immensely impressive. The shot creation, the defense, his touch around the rim, making shots both open and contested. The amount of flashes that this 6'9" wing has shown could make for an hour-long WB crossover, and the fact that he's one of the youngest players in this draft, I think he's 3rd or 4th youngest, makes him all the more fascinating, specifically as an OG Anunoby replacement with more notable upside, albeit equally questionable playmaking chops.
With a 2-point lead now on that 3, and there's Klintman. Here we go on the open floor. Klintman with the flush.
The appeal of Bobi Klintman is pretty simple. Do you like big wings who can hit threes? Do you like when they're 6'10" big? Technically 6'9", and look, Bobi is the wing for you if you want someone who can contribute right now as a 3-and-D wing. He can be a little inconsistent on both ends, and as far as upside goes, he doesn't have a ceiling as high as he is tall. I don't ever see him being a major distributor or having him put the ball on the floor very often, but As far as 3-and-D wings go, he's one of the more well-rounded options that you can expect to crop up in this range.
Burton has it poked away. Good defense by George.
Okay, so George has a pretty wide range as far as prospects go. He could very well be drafted with the Raptors' 19th overall pick, just as easily as he could find his name being called in the 30s. But regardless of where one places him, he's very much the type of player that would be perfect under Darko Rajakovic's .5 offensive system. A wing with playmaking chops, his seasonal stats don't stick out, but his feel for the game does. On ball, off ball, you just trust him to make the right decisions. Even with the college 3-point line being shorter than the NBA's and thus one having to take any outside shooting stat with a healthy dose of skepticism, him shooting almost 40% when guarded on catch-and-shoot 3-pointers jumps out and in a good way. The shot looks good, the splits even more so, and for a 6-foot wing, he's got a really nice handle with equally eye-catching playmaking. So why is a guy like George being even brought up as a potential second-rounder? Well, he's not very athletic. I hesitate to call him slow-footed since he does manage to cover a lot of ground simply due to his size, but like his stats don't stand out, his athleticism isn't worth noting, at least not in a positive manner.
Despite shooting sub 30%, lob it up top, Mogbo!
Jonathan Mogbo is one of those advanced stat drains that makes you wonder why they aren't talked about more often. For Toronto specifically, he is just about the perfect pick for both ends of the floor. One of the most efficient players in college basketball, an outstanding playmaker for his position who thrives in transition as either the ball handler or recipient, a switchable small ball 5 out like Draymond Green minus the assaults and the general likability, and those advanced stats. I don't want to turn this into a math lesson and start throwing numbers at you, so I'll just leave it at this. Jonathan far outplays his size and his competition with his ability to finish at the rim, resembling a traditional big man more than the 6'8" forward that he is, and most forwards can't handle the ball as well as he can either. If he could take and make some threes, then he'd be the complete package, but alas, his outside shot is yet to develop during his years in college. Granted, he's made major strides year over year, so it's not unreasonable to think that he'll be asked to work on that part of his game, let alone to think that he's capable of developing one, given his reported work ethic. That said, Mogbo might be a stretch to pick at the top of the second round, and that's where we're gonna get into trade talks. The Toronto Raptors have been pretty averse to making draft night trades, but between Bruce Brown's rapidly approaching team option, not to mention them needing to make a decision on Chris Boucher and his future with the team, I think this year might be an exception, especially if they want to make moves in free agency like they hinted at in the season exit interviews. As I'm recording this, both of them are still on the team, so who knows. Whether or not Bruce Brown will get a first in this year's draft or next year's is up in the air, not to mention the possibility of using him to move up in this draft instead of just picking at 19. I don't think Boucher has enough value to get a first on his own even in a perceived weak draft. He's probably closer to a second or two than he is a first round selection, and he's a surprisingly difficult player to match salaries for. Most playoff teams that could use an energy big like Chris won't have a trade exception to absorb him into or salary filler to make the money worth, so while 10 million doesn't sound like a lot on paper, there aren't a lot of obvious trade partners out there. Maybe the Clippers with PJ Tucker and that page. Look, I'm not going to turn this into a trade machine. All I'll say is that the Raptors have a lot of options for what they can do on draft night, whether it's trading up, down, or out of this year entirely. If they do decide to stick around, who are they going to pick, and where? Well, we'll find out in a couple of days. Until draft night, game on, my friends.